New listings were up almost 50%, but the average price also went up 1.5%. Let's talk about the January 2025 numbers and why all of this data could be extremely confusing. And let's actually break down what's important for you if you are a buyer or a seller looking to get into the market, because there are some factual data points that were not mentioned in any news article that I could find, which we should talk about in this video. In my last video, I broke down some of the key points for the market stats of January 2025. For this video, I'm going to break down the last video I did, which was the key takeaways of January. We're going to go through the actual data and numbers so you can get a really good idea of what's actually happening in the Toronto real estate market, because the media right now is talking about all these different factors and they can actually take any of these numbers and spin them any way they want. Let's break down what the actual facts are for January 2025. And if all of this data is a bit overwhelming for you and you just wanted to book in a strategy call so I can show you what's actually relevant to you and your situation, if you're a buyer or a seller looking to make a move in 2025, even if we're 6 to 8 months out, I just recommend always starting earlier than later. You can click on that first link down below or scan this QR code and book in a spring market strategy session so you can get a really good idea of what's to come and how to set yourself up for success. I typed in Toronto real estate into Google this morning and I couldn't believe some of the articles that popped up. And in fact, let's just jump right into what these articles look like right here on Google. Here are some of the top stories that popped up. Lower mortgage rates boost Toronto home sales, but will it last? Toronto home sales expected to rise 12% this year, but board says January saw a drop. Buyer gets second chance at her dream home. Toronto real estate prices rise as sales fall and inventory surges 70% higher. When taking a look at all of these articles, it's really hard to break down what exactly any of them actually mean. If I look at this one that says Toronto real estate prices rise as sales fall and inventory surges 70% higher, this doesn't really make sense to me. And this is why when you read these articles, it's so important to break down what they're actually referring to. And by the way, a lot of these articles refer to the greater Toronto area, not Toronto proper. So if you are looking to make a decision in Toronto, it's going to perform very differently than some of the other cities that are basically 2 to 2.5 hours away from the downtown core. We're going to start here with a quick overview of stats, but these charts are really going to get more in depth as we go along. Overall, greater Toronto area, around 4.5 months of inventory, pretty balanced, but average price up 1.5% from last year, even though active listings up 70%. And one thing to keep in mind is all this data is looking at last year, January of 2024. January 2024, the mortgage rates were almost 2 to 2.5% higher of where they are today. It is going to be a much different setup going into the spring market than what we saw last year. Total number of sales down about 8%. And I will show you one thing that really stood out to me when looking at those sales. Looking at Toronto proper, the price actually went up almost 3% year over year. And that's why we can't really take the greater Toronto area stats. We need to take a look at Toronto stats as a whole. And that's why the greater Toronto area does not tell the full story for Toronto. Active listings up about 50% from where they were last year in January, of course, and total number of sales down about 6% compared to last year. Months of inventory at 5. And as we will see later in this video, we're going to break that down by each property type: detached, semi-detached, townhouse and row houses, and condos. If we look at the condo corner, average sale price for Toronto condos just over $690,000. It's down about 2.5% from last year, and condo sales down about 15% from last year. But there is a golden nugget there that we will also discuss. When we look at this monthly sales data, and this is a ton of data to see on the screen. If you're watching on your TV, it might look better than if you're watching on your phone. But overall, months of inventory is what we've been talking about on this channel. It is generally a leading indicator of pricing. If we look at January 2024, and this is greater Toronto area wide, about 2.4 months of inventory. Right now we're at 4.5. Do you know what the easiest way to think about it is? If that months of inventory number, basically one in that number is what's selling. So if we're at 4.5, 1 in 4.5 properties right now are selling on the market, and the other 3.5 of them are sitting on the market. That is the easiest way to think about months of inventory. That's where we divide the active listings by the number of sales to come out with that number. Average days on market is actually exactly the same as where it was last year, just under 40 days on average on the market. An average price, of course, up from last year. Overall, it's relatively flat. The biggest thing to think about is that 1.1. We've been at basically that number for a long period of time. One of the keys that we spoke about in the last video was the Bank of Canada interest rate policy, and that has actually come down again in January on the 29th, down to an overnight lending rate of 3%. Last year at this time, we were at 5%. So 2% difference on the overnight lending rate. It's a huge difference in buying power for buyers. You're looking at around 20 to 25% more buying power than what you could have qualified for this time of last year. Let's couple that in with the new mortgage rules that came into effect on December 15th, 2024. And you can check out my channel because I do have a video specifically on that. But essentially, if you're under 1.5 million now, you do not need the full 20% down. That will seriously have an impact on the market when we talk about that $1 to $1.5 million range, which is already an active market in Toronto. If we take a look at the fixed side of things, and the fixed rate is actually tied to the bond market. All this talks about tariffs. What it's done is actually brought the bond yield down even more on the 5-year side. And this is the latest data from February the 4th, 2.66, which is much, much lower than where things were in the middle of 2023, and definitely lower than where things were in January of 2024. So how does this actually tie into pricing? And one of the things that I think gets misconstrued a little bit is that when rates come down, prices go up right away. I'd actually argue that when rates are stable, we start to see price growth. And if we look back to 2020, this is where we saw that stability in the interest rates, and then we saw prices start to increase. When those interest rates came up significantly, the pricing actually came down very quickly. So basically over that 6 to 7 month period of time, pricing came down like a train, and then we've kind of been sitting here for give or take almost 3 years. It's hard to think about, but the peak that everyone refers to is actually 3 years ago, and I'd argue we are so far beyond that timeline. 3 years is quite a long time, especially in real estate, in life. So seeing how things have basically been trending sideways for 3 years with ebbs and flows, we've been hovering on a Greater Toronto Area price point around that 1.1 million for basically 3 years of time, with some ebbs and flows through that. Now, this is where I do believe as rates stabilize, prices go up. And if we look here back in early 2023, we saw basically 5 months of stable rates. Prices went up basically about 20% in that time. They went up pretty quickly. And then the rates went up a couple times again, and prices basically just came down again. So we started to get that stable rate up here, but keep in mind, this is a very high rate, and all the anticipation was for lowering rates. So we didn't see a ton of price growth until the last couple of months of a high rate here, and then prices started to climb up there. But then as rates went down, an interesting side effect of that was that most buyers were just waiting for rates to go down even more. And I do believe most sellers were also waiting for the same thing. I'm going to show you some of the most interesting stats that I found in Toronto real estate. And this is not something that you will see out there in the news, because this is not something that gets broken down very well on those articles. But essentially, if we look at from January 1st, 2025 to January 31st, 2025, just around 1,366 sales overall. Condos made up 52% of those sales in January. This is pretty significant because when we talk about condo sales, a lot of people right now are saying that the condo market is totally dead. And while the condos aren't all moving, we are at about 6 months of inventory in Toronto, which we will get to. That being said, there are still condo sales happening. And if we just isolate for condos, 700 out of the 1,366 condos sold. And one thing that stands out the most to me is that there, of course, are different price points, and the most sales were in the 500 to 600, second most 600 to 700. But one thing we've been noticing in the market on the ground level, so I've been in competition for condos twice in the last month. And even though that sounds a little bit ironic with all the condos on the market, I would argue that at every $50,000 increment, I know these are by $100,000 increments, but at basically every $50,000 increment, there are basically 5 to 15 condos that are absolute standouts in each one of those price points. Finding those 15 condos that are over and above the rest of them in a buyer's certain price point is super important in today's market. And if you are looking to buy a condo in 2025, one of the things I've been doing with my clients is I will go through basically all the listings in their price point and pick out what I feel would be the top 10. So when we go to look at these properties, we're trying to check all their boxes. We're trying to make sure that it is great value for what it is, and how does it stand out among the rest of that sea of condos in certain price points. One of my biggest things is is where do you put the TV, or what does the view look like, or how are the finishes? Is there an element where on a future proof standpoint, and I talked about this in a previous video, what are you buying right now at a very good value that once the market does rebound in the condo sector will still stand out even more and appreciate even more than other properties that are basically the same budget right now? That's something definitely to consider. But as mentioned, 700 out of the 1366 sales in January, over 50% of sales were condos. If we take a look at the entire board, condos number one, detached made up about 25% of the market, semis about 9%, and condo townhouses 8%. Townhouses even smaller at about 2.5%. So not a ton of townhouse sales. And important to note that these are all the sales in those categories. If you look at detached, most of the detached properties happened over the $1 million mark, which is not surprising. Now, the other thing I wanted to mention is that most properties right now are selling somewhere between 97 to 98% of their list price. Now, this is where things get interesting talking about the market, is that if we take a look at the first 12 days in January, there were only 391 sales of that 1,370 sales. That is significant. That means that almost 70% of the transactions happened from January 13th to the end of the month. What that tells us, if we do isolate for January 13th into the 31st, what that shows us is almost 1,000 out of the 1,370 sales were in, give or take, the last 2 to 3 weeks of January. January felt like it was a forever month. But overall, that is quite notable because that means that all those buyers that were waiting for either better inventory to come up or for the holidays to be over started coming back in the second half of January. I could tell you firsthand that I've been in competition with buyers on semi-detached properties in the best areas with double-digit multiple offers. We saw 16 offers. I've seen 11, I've seen 10, I've seen 9, I've seen 8, I've seen all these levels of offers, and the ones that are in the best areas and the best houses are selling for significantly more money than what they're listed for. So it's really important to know that if you are looking in the city of Toronto in the best areas and the best pockets and the property is priced competitively, it will have a ton of attention. And I've also seen that at open houses, well over 100 people through the doors in a 2-day span. I'm not mentioning this out of a scenario to rush people to the market, but what I am saying is that if you're a buyer considering making a move in 2025, you need to know this data instead of just reading what's happening on the news articles, because actually being on the ground level, you can see it and feel how things are moving. And if you're a seller looking to get to market, there are a lot of properties for sale right now. But that being said, most buyers who are out there shopping right now have already seen the inventory that's been left over from last year or carried forward, and they're looking for that next best new products. So if you are a buyer or a seller looking to get into the market, again, scan that QR code. Let's have a chat to set you up for success in 2025, because having all the ducks lined up before getting out there in the market will be super important to maximize your experience, whether you're a buyer or a seller. And the other piece that I will say about the properties that are currently on the market that maybe have not sold, especially if they're in the best areas, there's generally 3 things that we need to make sure are really tight if we are on the selling side. First one, of course, is price. If the property is overpriced, it's generally sitting for longer. The second one is the presentation. So how does it look online? How does it look in person? And that ties in with the marketing as well. Is it getting showcased online properly? And if someone's going to look on Realtor.ca among a sea of all the listings out there, how does it look compared to the others? And if you are looking to see what others are looking like, I did attach a link to listed down below, and it ties in directly with MLS. So that way you can see what things are going for and what things are selling for as well, to give you a really good idea of what's happening in the market. Let's take a look at the detached market and where things were and what the months of inventory is looking like price-wise. So prices are down since October, which is pretty normal for this time of the year. Most people with the best detached properties are just starting to get to the market now, or still even waiting for better time to sell. It's not uncommon. We see this pretty often. In fact, there's basically half the amount of listings that were available in October in January, and about 4 months of inventory. So basically 1 in 4 are selling. And I can tell you firsthand, there's a lot of them on the market right now that need multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars of work to bring them up to speed. In one of my past videos talking about the flipping tax and now the new BC tax, those are properties that buyers just aren't going to be buying right now because they need so much work to get them back to where they should be, that if a buyer is going in with their life savings to purchase a property, even at like the $1.1 million mark, it's very unlikely that they will have the $400,000, $500,000, $600,000 to bring that property back up to the level that they're they're expecting or they're hoping. So those properties may sit for even longer. And if you're a buyer looking to maybe flip a property, there's not really any margin there once you factor in all the costs involved, the carry costs, the land transfer, the selling costs, all of it. There's not really a margin there. So those properties will be sitting for, I would anticipate, even longer moving forward. In the semi-detached market, and this is something you have to know about semis in Toronto, especially if you're looking in the West End, Roncy, Bloor West Village, if you're looking in the East End, Leslieville, Riverdale, Danforth, these areas are hot and these areas will remain hot. In fact, this month's of inventory is at 2, and that's actually generous for those areas. Those pockets are basically at 1 or below months of inventory. So every property that comes up on the market in those pockets, including ones that need a ton of work, are selling. And the one that had 16 offers the other day, that property was basically a full gut job, but the location was 10 out of 10. And it's a very desirable pocket. In fact, when we got there, there was a pile of cards on the table. There must have been at least 100 cards out there. It was a very, very busy listing. It sold significantly over asking, and it makes sense in that area because even if you put in the $400,000 to $600,000 that house may need, that house will most likely be worth it or more in the future. If we take a look at the average price, 1.15, again, this is going to go up significantly here as we go. The 1.3 is more in line with where these semis should be. And in fact, there was one the other day that sold for significantly more than this in one of those pockets. Taking a look at townhouses in Toronto, we actually saw prices go up quite a bit in January from where they were in December and November, but still not at October levels. Overall, there's just not a ton of freehold townhouses and row houses that come to the market. 114, about half available of what was there in October, and 34 sales. So at 3.5 months of inventory, I do feel this will tighten up as well, especially as the semis start getting more out of reach for buyers. They will most likely go to the townhouses. Now, everyone's question is what's going on in condo land. And in fact, we have seen less inventory than we had back in October, but there could be still some that are going to be trickling out. I have seen a lot of these properties that were on the market now pivot to just getting a renter back in and leasing them out. And that could be tied in with interest rates coming back down. So if someone was on a variable rate mortgage, then now their payments have come down significantly from where they were even a year ago today. But also if the properties weren't selling for a price that made sense for the sellers, they just ended up renting them out, and they will most likely be waiting for a couple more years to get back to market. Months of inventory at 6. So basically 1 in 6 condos are selling right now. And as mentioned, there was a good amount of condos that sold in January. In fact, at 50% of all sales in January being condos, that's pretty significant, especially moving forward. Average price hanging in there just over $690,000. I will say that there's most likely a lot of condos that haven't sold that would be bringing this price point down, but because they didn't sell and they went back to the rental market, they aren't being counted in as sales, which would make this number move. So just something to consider there for condos. And if you are looking to purchase a condo, make sure you try and check as many boxes as possible right now, because it is possible to do so in today's market. Those are the in-depth stats for January 2025. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below on what you've been seeing out there, what you feel is going to happen in the rest of 2025. And even if you just had thoughts on Toronto real estate in general. I'm Michael Ouzas. Thanks for watching.